Let me tell you something about the fall Daniel got married. I want you to picture it exactly the way I lived it, because if I just gave you the outline, you'd miss everything that mattered. You'd miss the way the light came through the kitchen window that September morning, soft and golden and almost too pretty, like the world was showing off a little. You'd miss the smell of the coffee I'd had brewing since 6 a.m. because I was too excited to sleep. You'd miss the sound of my own laugh. And I used to have a good laugh, a big, warm, unself-conscious laugh, bouncing off the walls of a house that finally, after a few quiet and somewhat lonely years, felt full of purpose again. Hey everyone, thank you for joining me tonight. It really warms my heart to see you here. If you like these kinds of real, emotional stories, told like we're just sitting together having a cup of tea, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell. It helps this little channel so much. All right, are you comfortable? Then let's begin. So let me back up. Let me take you all the way back to the beginning, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. And I mean the real beginning, not the dramatic part, not the part that made me furious and then made me understand what fury is actually for. I mean the part before all of that, the long, warm, ordinary stretch of years that made everything else so much harder to accept when it came. My name is Carol Ann Mercer, though I've been going by Carol Mitchell for 32 years, ever since I married and then unmarried Robert Mitchell, which is a whole other story and not the one I'm telling today. I'm 63 years old. I have one son. His name is Daniel, and for most of his life, he was the best thing I ever did. I mean that without any asterisk or qualification. I'm not being sentimental and looking back at the past through the kind of soft focus lens that people sometimes use when things go wrong and they want to reconstruct someone as having been better than they were. I'm telling you plainly and accurately, Daniel Robert Mitchell was a remarkable kid. He was curious and funny, and most importantly, kind in that effortless, unforced way that you honestly cannot teach a child. Either they have it or they don't, and he had it from the start. He was born on a Tuesday in October, and I remember the exact weight of him when they placed him in my arms, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. And I remember thinking with complete and astonishing clarity, this is it. This is what I was supposed to be doing all along. I was 27 years old, and I already knew that whatever came before and whatever came after, this moment was the center of everything. That's a thing people say, and it sounds like a cliché, and I'm here to tell you that clichés get to be clichés because they are true often enough, and this one was true for me. His father, Robert, and I had our problems. We had a lot of problems. Robert was a good-looking man with a tremendous amount of charm and a limited amount of follow-through, and after 12 years of making excuses for him and quietly picking up whatever he dropped, I finally asked him to leave. Daniel was 9. He took it hard the way kids take those things, mostly silently, with occasional eruptions of confused anger that weren't really about what they appeared to be about. He'd get mad about something small, a change in dinner plans or a forgotten permission slip, and the anger would be out of proportion, and I understood that the real anger was underneath, and I let him have the surface anger, because sometimes that's all you can offer a 9-year-old boy who is learning that the world isn't always as safe as he thought it was. We got through it. Daniel and I, we got through it together. That's the thing about single parenting that people who haven't done it don't fully understand. When it works, really works, you build something with your kid that has a different quality than almost any other relationship on earth. You face things together. You figure things out together. You celebrate together when the celebrating happens, and you hunker down together when the hunkering is required. And over all those years of doing life as a two-person team, you build a closeness that is simply unlike anything else. The understanding runs very deep. I worked as an office manager for a dental practice for 21 years. Dr. Harlan Fitch, who was a decent man and a meticulous dentist, and who genuinely could not have kept his own calendar without me, not because he wasn't intelligent, he absolutely was, but because the administrative dimension of running a healthcare practice is its own world, and it simply was not his world. I organized everything. I knew every patient's name, every insurance code, every quirk of the billing software, every vendor relationship, every state regulation that applied to the practice. I was the kind of employee that companies rely on deeply and sometimes forget to properly appreciate, not out of malice, but out of the comfortable assumption that things will always just work because they always have worked. But I kept showing up because the work was steady and the benefits were solid, and I was building something: a savings account, a retirement account, a credit history clean as a whistle, and a house, a real house. 3 bedrooms, a small study, a backyard with a silver maple that I planted myself on Clover Street in Denton, a small suburb 20 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. I bought that house when Daniel was 12. I had been saving since before the divorce, had continued saving through the divorce, and had saved every spare dollar I could manage for 3 years after. I put 20% down, I signed the papers at the title company on a Wednesday afternoon in April, and the agent handed me the keys, 2 of them on a little ring with a paper tag that said my address, and I drove to the house alone, let myself in, walked through the empty rooms, and stood in the middle of the living room with the afternoon light coming through the window and the echo of my own footsteps bouncing around me, and I cried. Not sad crying, just the kind of crying that happens when something you wanted very badly and worked incredibly hard for actually comes true. The relief of it, the satisfaction of it, the sheer fact of it just came out. Daniel grew up in that house. He did his homework at the kitchen table under the light that hung too low and that I always meant to raise but never quite got around to. He played video games in the basement with his friends on Friday nights, the sound of it thumping up through the floor in a way I pretended to find annoying and actually found enormously comforting. He learned to drive in the parking lot of the empty shopping center 2 miles away, and I sat in the passenger seat with my heart in my mouth every time and never showed it. He graduated from high school and then from Ohio State with a degree in civil engineering, and I drove to his graduation alone and sat in the bleachers and watched him cross that stage, and I thought about the 9-year-old boy with the misplaced anger and the 7-pound, 4-ounce baby and every version of him I had ever loved, which is all of them, which is every single one. He brought home a string of girlfriends over the years, starting with a sweet, freckled girl named Kayla in 9th grade, who was lovely and shy and gave him a friendship bracelet that he kept on his wrist for 6 months after they broke up, and ending eventually with Jessica. Now, Jessica, I need to tell you about her the right way. I want to be very clear about something before I say anything else about her. When Daniel first brought her home, I liked her. I genuinely, unreservedly liked her. I'm telling you this up front, not as a disclaimer or a setup, but because it is the honest and essential truth of what happened, and without it, you would not understand how this story could go the way it went. I was not one of those mothers, the suspicious ones, the territorial ones, the ones who view every girlfriend as a rival. I had thought seriously about that pattern when Daniel first started dating seriously, and I had made a private commitment to myself that I was not going to be that woman. I wanted him to find someone. I wanted him to be happy and partnered and building a life of his own, something complete and solid. I had been lonely enough in my own post-divorce years, and lonely in a very specific way, the kind where you are surrounded by people and conversations and routines, but something at the center of your days is very quiet. I didn't want that for him. I wanted him full. Jessica Paulson was 29 when Daniel brought her to Sunday dinner for the first time. He was 31. She had straight, dark hair that she kept in a low ponytail, and she had these sharp, bright eyes that were brown but caught the light in a way that made them look almost amber sometimes, like honey held up to a window. She was a paralegal at a firm downtown. She was articulate in the specific way of someone who has spent years listening to lawyers think out loud and has absorbed a great deal of precision along the way. She had opinions about things, and she wasn't shy about sharing them, which I actually found refreshing. I had grown a little tired of the quiet, agreeable girls Daniel sometimes brought around who would nod enthusiastically at everything I said with such lavish approval that after a while it started to feel less like warmth and more like performance. Jessica was not performing. That was my clear impression. She was just there, present, direct, confident in a way that wasn't aggressive but simply wasn't shy. She shook my hand firmly at the door that first night and said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I've heard so much about you. Daniel talks about you constantly." And she said it in a way that didn't feel like something she'd rehearsed in the car on the way over. It had the texture of a true thing. We sat around my kitchen table. I always used the kitchen for family dinners. The dining room felt too formal and a little sad, like trying too hard. And I had made pot roast because that was Daniel's favorite, had been his favorite since he was 7 years old, and I figured out that the secret was a splash of balsamic vinegar in the braising liquid, which sounds like it shouldn't work and absolutely does. We talked for almost 3 hours, not careful getting-to-know-you small talk, not the stilted question and answer of a first meeting, but real conversation about Daniel's new position at the engineering firm and the infrastructure project he was excited about Jessica's work and her genuinely complicated feelings about the legal system, the parts she admired and the parts she found deeply inadequate, about a documentary they'd watched the week before on the decline of American manufacturing, about a trip they were thinking about taking to Portugal in the spring, about a neighborhood restaurant that had just closed that they both mourned. I refilled the wine glasses twice, and we had dessert, a peach cobbler, late-season peaches from the market at the end of Clover Street. And when they finally stood up to leave, it was past 10 o'clock, and I walked them to the door, and Jessica stopped and said, "Thank you. This was really genuinely lovely." Not with effusiveness, just plainly. I remember thinking, driving back from dropping off the leftover cobbler at my neighbor Ruth's place later that evening. Ruth had a sweet tooth, and I always tried to offload desserts before I ate the whole thing myself, that this was going to be good. I had a feeling about it. 31 years of motherhood and 21 years of managing human beings in a professional context gives you a pretty well-calibrated sense of people, and something told me Jessica Paulson was going to be around for a while. I was right about that part. Over the next year and a half, Jessica became a regular fixture. She and Daniel came for dinner at least twice a month, sometimes more if they were in the neighborhood for one reason or another. Jessica started texting me independently of Daniel, little things, a recipe she'd asked about at dinner, a recommendation for a movie I'd mentioned I'd been meaning to see, a link to an article she'd read that she thought I'd find interesting. She remembered things. She had this particular quality of attention that made you feel like what you said actually landed and stayed, which is rarer than it should be. I remember once, maybe 3 months into her and Daniel dating, I had mentioned in the middle of some completely unrelated conversation that I'd been having trouble sleeping, not making a big deal of it, just noting it in passing. I think we were talking about work stress or the news or something along those lines. 2 weeks later, she arrived for Sunday dinner with a small, pretty tin of chamomile lavender tea and a handwritten card that said, "Saw this and thought of you. Hope it helps."
And the thing is, if someone had bought me lavender tea and made a production of it, it would have been sweet, but a little much. The way Jessica did it, casually, with no expectation of a big reaction, just slipping it on the counter when she came in, it felt natural, genuine. I introduced her to my sister Patricia, who's 2 years older than me and has always been the more skeptical of the two of us. Patricia's default setting for any new person is measured skepticism, which has served her very well over the years and which I have always respected, even when it was occasionally exhausting. Patricia came away from meeting Jessica saying, with the particular brevity that Patricia uses when she means a compliment and doesn't want to oversell it, "She seems sharp. I like her." From Patricia, that was practically a standing ovation. Daniel proposed to Jessica 14 months after they started dating. He called me the morning he was going to do it. He was taking her to the restaurant on the roof of the hotel downtown, the same place they'd had their first real date, and he was so nervous he could barely form a complete sentence. He called at 7:40 in the morning, which in itself told me how rattled he was because Daniel had never, in 31 years, voluntarily spoken to me before 9 a.m. with compelling reason. "Mom, what if she says no? Do you think she'll say no? You know her pretty well now. Do you think she wants, right? You'd have a sense." "Daniel," I said, "she is going to say yes. She is going to cry. She is going to say yes. And you are going to have a memory that you carry for the rest of your life. Now go take a breath and go buy some flowers, please." He laughed, that shaky, grateful laugh of someone receiving exactly the reassurance they needed. Yeah, okay. I love her, Mom. Like really, genuinely love her, more than I knew I was going to." "I know," I said. "I can tell every time I see you together. Now go and call me the second it happens." She said yes. Of course she said yes. He called me at 9:17 that evening, and I could hear the happiness in his voice from a mile away, pure and round and very young sounding, in a way that made my chest hurt with something that was almost too tender to name. He put Jessica on, and she laughed and showed me the ring through the phone camera, and the ring was lovely and simple, and I told her it was perfect, and it was. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a little while in the quiet, happy way you sit after something good has happened. I thought about grandchildren, which felt like a reasonable thing to think about. I thought about holidays and traditions expanding. I thought about this new shape the family was taking and how welcome it felt. The wedding planning started immediately, which in retrospect I can appreciate was both because Jessica was organized and clear-minded and because they had reasons to move quickly. But I didn't know that then, and I'm getting ahead of myself. They set a date, the second Saturday in September, 11 months out. They found a venue without much searching, a beautiful old restored barn about 40 minutes outside the city, a place that had been converted by a couple who'd bought it in rough shape and spent 3 years making it extraordinary. White walls inside, exposed old timber beams, original wide plank floors that had been refinished a warm honey color, a field behind it where you could do an outdoor ceremony, and beyond the field a tree line that in September would just be starting to show color. It was exactly the kind of place that manages to look effortlessly beautiful while concealing the considerable effort behind it. They booked a photographer and a caterer within the first 2 months. I helped look at floral options because I've always loved flowers and know a little about them. Nothing professional, just the kind of knowledge you accumulate from 30 years of gardening. And we had a very pleasant afternoon visiting a florist on the east side who had opinions about things and made us sample tea and told us exactly why peonies were not available in September and offered 4 equally beautiful alternatives. And then came the conversation about money. I want to tell this part carefully and completely because I want you to understand exactly what was said and exactly how I felt, because it matters enormously for everything that comes later. I want you to understand that I was not pressured, I was not manipulated at that point. The request, when it came, was genuine and appropriately humble, and I responded to it with full information and full choice. I want you to hold on to that clarity because later people, certain people, would try to suggest otherwise. Daniel came over alone one Saturday in November, about 2 months after the engagement. Jessica was at a bridal shower for a friend, some college roommate getting married in the spring. We sat in the living room with coffee, and Daniel was fidgety in the specific way he'd always been fidgety since he was a child when he had something on his mind he was working up to, bouncing his knee, unable to fully settle. I used to call it his simmering pot look, when something was on the burner but not quite ready to come to surface. "Mom," he said finally, "can I ask you something?" "You can always ask me anything, you know that." He looked at his hands wrapped around the coffee mug. "The wedding is going to be more expensive than we thought. Even cutting back where we can, we're looking at somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 to have what we want. And what we want isn't even extravagant. We're not doing ice sculptures or anything. It's just venues cost what they cost, catering costs what it cost, and it adds up in ways that are honestly a little breathtaking." I nodded. I had been keeping half an eye on wedding costs out of a background awareness that this conversation might be coming someday, and they had become, in the last decade, genuinely extraordinary. The venue alone for a decent Saturday in September could run $6,000 to $10,000 before anyone had eaten a single bite. "We have some savings," Daniel said. "Between the two of us, we can pull together about $15,000 without completely wiping ourselves out. Jessica's dad is on a fixed income. He retired early for health reasons, and her mom has had some medical bills in the past couple years. They genuinely don't have it, and Jess would rather they just come and enjoy themselves as guests than feel any pressure or obligation. So," he paused. "I was wondering if, only if it makes sense, only if it's genuinely okay, whether you might be able to help cover some of the difference." He looked up at me then, and his face had an expression I knew so well it nearly broke my heart with tenderness. He looked like he had looked at 14 when his baseball glove finally fell apart beyond repair and he needed a new one, and I was in a tight month and he didn't want to ask. He looked like he had looked at 23 when his transmission went and he tried to figure out 3 alternatives before finally calling me. He was never a kid who assumed things were owed to him. That was truly one of the things I was most proud of in how he'd grown up. "How much are we talking?" I asked. He named the number, $30,000. I was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly, thinking. I'm a deliberate person. I don't believe in making major decisions on emotion alone, no matter how good the emotion feels. I wanted to be clear-eyed about what I had and what this would mean. I ran through the numbers in my head, not with a spreadsheet, but with the accuracy of someone who has been managing her own finances carefully and with full attention for a very long time. I knew my savings account, my retirement account, my monthly expenses, my expected income for the next year. I knew precisely what I could give without discomfort and without risk. $30,000 would leave me comfortable. Not extravagant, but comfortable, as I had always lived. It would not endanger my retirement timeline. It would not compromise my emergency fund. It was a significant sum, but it was not a crippling one. And he was my son, getting married to a woman I liked and respected. One of the biggest moments of his adult life was approaching, and I had the means to help make it what he wanted it to be. "Okay," I said. He blinked, like he'd been braced for negotiation and hadn't expected a clean answer. "Okay? Yes, I'll give you $30,000 for the wedding." He put the coffee mug down and crossed the room and hugged me the way he hadn't hugged me since he was maybe 16, completely and without reservation, both arms, not the careful side hug that grown men sometimes default to when affection feels complicated. He held on for a long moment, and I hugged him back, and I thought, this is what money is for. Not for sitting in an account, growing numbers, not for someday, not for an abstraction. For this. We talked about the logistics for a while. The money would come in 2 parts, $15,000 right away to lock in the venue and the caterer, and another $15,000 in the spring when the remaining deposits and final payments came due. I would write the checks directly to Daniel, and he and Jessica would handle the actual payments to vendors. There was no formal paperwork, no promissory note, no repayment agreement. I gave it as a gift, explicitly and deliberately. I want you to hold on to that clarity, the way I've had to hold on to it myself in moments when other people tried to muddy it. The months between that conversation and the wedding were among the loveliest I can remember. I was involved in the planning in exactly the right measure, consulted where my opinion was genuinely wanted, trusted to have taste, but not expected to manage things that weren't mine to manage. It was a very mature division of roles looking back on it, and I think it came from Jessica's particular social intelligence. She knew how to include a mother-in-law without being sycophantic about it and without ceding actual authority over her own wedding. Jessica's mother, Donna, took a shine on me in a way that felt mutual and real. Donna was a soft-spoken woman with a bad hip and a dry, self-deprecating sense of humor that took me a couple of meetings to fully appreciate and that I liked enormously once I did. The dress shopping afternoon, Jessica, me, and Donna at a boutique on the north side, was one of those experiences that sounds like it should be cliched and wasn't at all. The boutique was small and smelled like gardenias, and the woman who ran it had strong opinions that she delivered gently and was invariably right. We sat in the little chairs outside the fitting room with glasses of complimentary champagne and watched Jessica come out in dress after dress, each one beautiful in its way and each one somehow not quite the answer. And then she came out in the one. Ivory, with a simple fitted bodice and a long flowing skirt that moved when she walked with this quiet, elegant ease. No embellishment, no drama, clean and beautiful, and clearly completely her. Donna and I looked at each other. We both started crying at the exact same moment, which was then immediately followed by both of us laughing at ourselves for being so perfectly predictable, which made Jessica laugh too, which was exactly right. My own dress was a deep, dusty rose. Daniel had asked me specifically to move away from the pale blues and soft lilacs that are the default mother of the groom uniform, and I appreciated being given that instruction because it meant he was actually thinking about me as a person and not as a role to be costumed. I found it at a boutique downtown, a wrap dress with a flowing hem that was both comfortable enough to actually wear for 6 hours and beautiful enough that when I looked in the mirror at home before the wedding morning, I felt genuinely, and without having to talk myself into it, lovely. The night before the wedding, Daniel came by, just the two of us. He didn't call ahead, just showed up at 7 in the evening with a bottle of wine and a look on his face that was somewhere between peaceful and nostalgic. I had already made chicken soup because I had been doing that, making his favorite things on instinct, the way mothers do when something is changing. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd eaten 1,000 dinners and done homework and argued about curfews and talked through breakups and celebrated accomplishments, and we were quieter than usual. Not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet you can only have with someone you have known for a very long time.
"You nervous?" I asked. "Not about marrying Jess," he said, not even a half-second's hesitation.
not even the smallest amount. But it feels big, like I keep feeling like something is ending. Something is, I said, a particular chapter, and something better is starting. He looked at me with a warmth that was so uncomplicated and direct it almost undid me. Not the managed warmth of performance, but the real, unguarded thing. I couldn't have done any of this without you, he said. Not just the money, I mean, the whole thing, all of it. Everything you did all these years. I just want you to know I see it. I had to look away for a second. I know, I said, when I had my voice back. Now eat your soup before it gets cold. He laughed and ate his soup, and we stayed at that kitchen table until almost midnight, talking about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you can only really talk with someone who has been your person for a very long time. The wedding was perfect. I'm not going to elaborate at length because I don't think I could do it justice, and because some things are better carried privately anyway, but I will tell you this. The September day cooperated completely, warm and bright with a breeze just soft enough to make everything comfortable. The ceremony was held in the field behind the barn, under a wooden arch wrapped in greenery and small white blooms. Daniel cried when Jessica came down the aisle, and I cried watching him cry, and I was not a little embarrassed about any of it. During the reception, between the salad and the entree, Daniel found me at my table and pulled me out to the dance floor for a slower song. We danced, my son and I, in a barn on a September evening, and at some point during the second chorus of whatever that song was, I said quietly and only to myself, "Remember this. Whatever comes next in your life, Carol, remember this exactly as it is." I remembered it. In ways and for reasons I didn't anticipate when I said it. To be honest, I remembered it in ways and for reasons I didn't anticipate when I said it. I remembered it in ways and for reasons I didn't anticipate when I said it. To be honest, I remembered it in ways and for reasons I didn't anticipate when I said it. The trouble with hindsight is the shame of it. You look back across all the moments you dismissed or talked yourself out of, and you think, how did I not see what this was? But I've thought about this a great deal, and I believe that most reasonable people, given what I knew and what I wanted to be true, would have done exactly what I did, because the early signs were genuinely small, genuinely ambiguous, genuinely possible to assign innocent explanations to if you were inclined to assign them, and I was inclined because the love was real and the history was long, and the alternative explanation was one I was not yet ready to look at directly. The first small thing happened about 3 weeks after the wedding. Daniel and Jessica had returned from their honeymoon in Barcelona, 10 days, which they'd paid for themselves because I had already done my part, and they came back tanned and full of stories. We had them for dinner the first Saturday after they got back, and it was warm and easy, and Jessica showed me photos on her phone of a little tapas bar they'd found on a back street in the Gothic Quarter that apparently had the best patatas bravas in human history, and everything seemed exactly as it should be. But then, as they were putting on coats and getting ready to leave, Daniel and I ended up in the kitchen alone for a minute while Jessica was in the bathroom, and I mentioned, with no particular weight to it at all, just conversationally, that I was thinking about repainting the living room. The color had been there almost 8 years, and I was restless for a change, thinking about something warmer. "You should do it," Daniel said, his attention slightly elsewhere, fiddling with his keys. "Although, honestly, Mom, do you really want to be sinking more money into that house? It's getting up there in years." It was a strange thing to say, not cruel, not alarming, just odd, off note, like a wrong chord in a piece of music you know very well. I looked at him for a moment and said, "It's my house," I said, mildly. "I like it." I know, And then Jessica came back and we said our goodnights and they left. I stood at the door and watched their taillights disappear around the corner, and I turned it over in my mind briefly, and then I filed it under exhaustion. He'd been traveling for 2 weeks, was back at work in the middle of a big project. People say odd things when they're tired. I let it go. The second small thing happened about 6 weeks after that, and this one was harder to ignore, not because of anything Daniel said directly to me, but because of what my sister Patricia told me. Patricia and I have a standing Thursday lunch date. We've been doing it for close to 15 years at this Greek restaurant on the West Side that has not changed its menu in all of that time, which I find deeply comforting. We were halfway through our spanakopita when Patricia set down her fork and said, in the particular careful way she has when she's about to say something she's thought hard about, "Can I ask you something without getting defensive?" "I can try," I said. "Has Daniel mentioned anything to you about future plans, long-term plans for you?" Something in my chest went still. "What do you mean, future plans?" "He called me," Patricia said, "about 2 weeks ago, out of the blue. He asked me, and I want to say that I thought it was a strange thing to ask, and I've been turning it over since. He asked me whether you thought you'd ever consider downsizing from the house." I was quiet. He said something about how the house was a lot for one person to manage, and that maybe it would make more sense financially and from a support standpoint for you to think about somewhere smaller or somewhere with, quote, more support available. He said all this to you? He did. And not to me? Patricia looked at me steadily. That was the thing I kept coming back to. I drove home from that lunch running it through my mind. I tried the charitable version. Maybe he was genuinely concerned and didn't know how to raise it with me directly and wanted Patricia's read first. Maybe it was a clumsy expression of care. Maybe he'd had some conversation with Jessica about parents aging and it had gotten him thinking in abstract terms that he hadn't yet figured out how to make concrete. I told myself all of those things. I believe I half believed them. But somewhere, very quietly, underneath all the explaining, something small and patient had settled in and was waiting. The fall passed. I watched and listened and continued having Daniel and Jessica over for dinner, continued texting with Jessica, continued being, outwardly, entirely myself. I'm a person who has learned to carry more than one truth at once, to feel love and wariness simultaneously, to behave warmly while thinking carefully. This is a skill I developed over years, and it's served me well now. In October, Daniel made a comment during dinner. We were talking about retirement planning. He'd been reading something about index funds that in retrospect had more to it than I initially registered. He mentioned in a casual, parenthetical way that it might be worth me thinking about consolidating some of my accounts. Just from a management standpoint, he said, it's a lot easier to keep track of things when everything is in one place. And then he moved immediately on to something else, and I let it pass because at the time it registered as a reasonable thing to say rather than as what it was, a probe. In November, Jessica mentioned that her firm did some estate planning work, and if I ever wanted a referral to one of the estate planning attorneys, she was happy to put me in touch with someone. She said it pleasantly, in passing, the way people sometimes mention professional connections. I said I already had a lawyer I was happy with, thank you. She said, great, of course. We moved on. In December, at Christmas, the first Christmas with Jessica as an official family member, which I had been looking forward to for weeks, we were opening gifts in my living room, and Jessica looked around the room with what I now understand was a different kind of eye than I attributed to her at the time, and she said, you know, this house has such good bones. In the right market, it would sell beautifully. She said it the way people say things they've been thinking about for a while and finally let slip because their guard is slightly lower than usual. I looked at her. She was already unwrapping another gift and didn't see my expression, which was probably for the best. I thought about that comment for a few days. I thought about it alongside Patricia's conversation and the downsizing language and the account consolidation suggestion. I lined them up and looked at them. Then I told myself I was adding too many things that were individually harmless and reading in a direction I didn't want to go. But the thing about doing that, the thing about deliberately looking away, is that you can only do it so many times before the pattern outgrows your willingness to ignore it. Spring came slowly that year. There was a lot of rain in March and April, the gray, persistent kind that keeps everything damp and makes the days feel shorter than they are. I was consulting twice a week at the dental practice. I was walking my 3 miles most mornings in whatever weather I could manage. I was maintaining my house and my garden and my routines. My life was organized and purposeful and mine. Daniel and Jessica came over in March for dinner, and Jessica asked over dessert and very sweetly whether I had an updated will. Just making sure, she said. She and Daniel had been thinking about their own estate planning, and it had gotten her thinking about people in her life whose plans might need updating. I looked at her across the table. There was a particular quality of my stillness in that moment that I have come to recognize as my own private alarm system, the kind of quiet that falls over me when something requires more careful attention than the surface of it suggests. I have a will, I said. It's been updated within the last 5 years. My lawyer helped me with it. Oh, wonderful, Jessica said. She appeared to relax very slightly. Who's your lawyer? Just out of curiosity, in case you ever wanted a second opinion on anything. Gerald Watts. He's been my lawyer for 12 years, and I have complete confidence in him. I changed the subject. The rest of the dinner was pleasant, but I carried something home with me that night that I hadn't carried in before, something not quite suspicion and not quite fear, more like the physical sensation of something slightly out of balance, an alertness. Then came April and the filing cabinet. I came home on a Thursday afternoon from my consulting shift. I usually got home around 4:15, to find Daniel's car in my driveway. He had always had a key to my house. He'd had one since he was a teenager, and even after he'd moved out, he'd kept a copy, partly for convenience and partly because I had always thought it mattered for grown children to feel that a parent's home was still, in some sense, a place that belonged to them too. I liked that he had it. I had always liked it. He sometimes used it to drop things off or pick things up when I was at work with a quick text to let me know. I always thought that was considerate. But on this particular Thursday, there was no text, and when I walked in and called his name, he didn't answer from the kitchen or the living room or the basement. I found him in my home office. He was sitting at my desk, my chair, my desk, in front of my filing cabinet, which had the second drawer open. When I walked in, the sound of my footstep was apparently not what he was expecting because he startled. Genuinely startled, the kind that involves the whole body and is impossible to fake. "Mom, hey, I didn't hear you come in." I stood in the doorway, and I looked at the open drawer, and I looked at him, and I felt something in me, something precise and careful and very cold, come fully awake. "What are you doing?" I asked. I kept my voice entirely neutral. "I was just—" He pushed the drawer shut in a single smooth motion. "You mentioned once you had an old photo somewhere of Dad's fishing trip. I was out this way, and I thought I'd see if I could find it without bothering you. You said it might be in this area of the house somewhere." Now, I thought about this very carefully standing in that doorway. Had I ever mentioned a photo of Robert's fishing trip? I thought I might have, yes, vaguely, in passing, months ago. Had I said it was in the filing cabinet? I was quite sure I had not. Had I indicated it was in the office? I could not imagine why I would have. "I didn't find it," he said, standing up, his voice carrying the careful casualty of someone managing how he sounds. "Sorry, I really should have texted first." "Yes, you should have." He left 20 minutes later. He was normal, warm, easy for those 20 minutes, but there was something slightly elevated about him, a quality of too carefully maintained normalcy that I had perhaps been registering for months without naming. I stood in my office for a long time after I heard his car back out of the driveway. I opened the filing cabinet. Everything appeared to be in its correct location, but I'm a meticulous person. Years of running an office will do that, and I know where everything goes and how things are arranged, and I had the distinct and specific sensation that things had been looked at, handled, replaced with the intention of appearing untouched.
I thought about what was in that filing cabinet. My will, my bank account statements, 5 years of them, neatly labeled by year, the deed to my house, my investment account documents, insurance policies, the kind of comprehensive financial portrait that would tell a very interested person everything they wanted to know about what I had and how much of it there was. I closed the cabinet. I went to the kitchen and I made tea, and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought, without flinching this time, about the picture that all these pieces, taken together, were making. The following week, I called my neighbor Ruth. Actually, Ruth called me first. Ruth has lived 3 houses down for 15 years. She is a retired school librarian, which might sound like a soft credential, but is actually excellent preparation for detecting nonsense, because librarians spend their careers teaching people to evaluate sources and distinguish reliable information from unreliable claims. And Ruth applies this skill to human beings as readily as she applies it to texts. She said, "Carol, can you come over for coffee? There's something I want to tell you." I went. I sat at Ruth's kitchen table and drank her terrible coffee, which I have always found oddly comforting in its awfulness, like a guarantee of consistency. And Ruth told me this. 2 weeks prior, on a Wednesday morning when she knew I was at my consulting job, she had looked out her front window and seen Daniel's car pull into my driveway. She'd seen him and Jessica let themselves in. She hadn't thought much of it initially. But then, about 40 minutes later, they came back out with a third person, a woman she didn't recognize. Professional-looking blazer, good shoes, carrying a clipboard and what looked like a measuring device. The kind of person who is very specifically not a social visitor. "I thought maybe they'd called someone about the gutters," Ruth said, "or maybe a home inspector for some reason. But I was watering my front plants. I was being nosy, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And I could see that they were walking around the outside of the house, too. The woman was looking at the foundation. She was looking at the windows and the roof line. She was writing things down very carefully." Ruth paused and looked at me with those sharp librarian eyes of hers. "Do you think it was a real estate appraiser?" The words sat on the table between us like something substantial. "I don't know," I said. "You're not selling the house," Ruth said. It was not a question. "No," I said, "I am not." "Then I thought you should know," Ruth said simply, and poured me more terrible coffee. I drove home from Ruth's house and I sat in my living room, in the house I had bought with my own money and my own determination, and for the first time I allowed myself to look at the whole picture without flinching. Not half of it, not most of it, all of it. The comment about sinking money into the house in November, Patricia's account of Daniel's call, the Christmas remark about good bones and selling beautifully, the office, the filing cabinet, the startled look on his face, Ruth's account of the appraiser. Someone was trying to figure out what I had,
and someone was perhaps already beginning to move on it. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that. What happened inside me was almost the opposite of panic. A settling, a hardening of resolve, a very specific and practical clarity about what I needed to do. The first thing I did was nothing visible. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't say anything to Jessica. I did not change my behavior in any way that they could see, because I had enough instinct to understand that the moment they knew I knew, they would start working faster and more carefully, and I needed time. The second thing I did was call Gerald Watts. Gerald is a small, precise man with round tortoiseshell glasses and a habit of tapping his pen against his legal pad in a rhythmic, thoughtful way that I have always found oddly reassuring, like a metronome that keeps the conversation orderly. He has been my lawyer for 12 years, through my divorce paperwork, through the house purchase, through my original will and its subsequent updates, through a minor dispute with a contractor 6 years ago that never went anywhere because Gerald wrote a very carefully worded letter and it resolved itself. He is the most organized person I know, and I trust him completely. I called him on a Friday afternoon, and I told him I needed an appointment. He said, "Monday morning?" I said, 9 o'clock, yes. That weekend, I started keeping records. I bought a small, spiral-bound notebook at the drugstore, the kind you get in the office supplies aisle, nothing special, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I wrote down everything. Every incident, every comment, every conversation, as much detail as I could reconstruct, with dates wherever I had them. The comment about the house in November, Patricia's account of Daniel's call, the Christmas remark about good bones and selling beautifully, the office, the filing cabinet, the startled look on his face, Ruth's account of the appraiser. I wrote for 2 hours. When I was done, I had 4 pages of small, careful notes. I also called Patricia and asked her to do the same, to write down from her own memory and perspective every conversation she'd had with Daniel where my future or my assets or my living situation came up. Patricia didn't ask me a lot of questions. She said, "Give me tonight and I'll have something for you by tomorrow." She came over Saturday morning with a handwritten account of 5 separate phone calls from Daniel with estimated dates for 4 of them, approximate dates for the 5th, and a clear, specific summary of the substance of each one. Patricia, the retired school administrator, writes very good memos. I was not surprised, and I was deeply grateful. I called Ruth and asked her to write her own account of what she had seen, and she did so without hesitation and with, I suspected, some satisfaction. Ruth likes things to be documented. Monday morning, I was in Gerald's office at 9 exactly. I put the notebook on his desk, and I said, "I need you to read this first." He read it. He didn't say anything while he read. He tapped his pen twice, very lightly, at the end of the filing cabinet entry, and once more at Ruth's account of the appraiser. When he was done, he looked up at me. "Tell me about your will as it currently stands," he said. I told him. Daniel was my primary beneficiary. He was also designated as my healthcare proxy, meaning he could make medical decisions on my behalf if I were unable, and as the executor of my estate. Gerald looked at me over his glasses for a long, level moment. "Carol, I want to talk about the healthcare proxy designation first, because I think that's the most immediately significant piece of what you're telling me." He explained. Healthcare proxy is not just about hospital decisions. Combined with an aggressive guardianship petition, a healthcare proxy designation can be used to argue that a person has already expressed intent to delegate medical and personal decision-making, which can be leveraged in court to support a broader claim of managed care. It's not airtight, but it adds a layer of credibility to a case that wouldn't otherwise have one. "What you're describing across these incidents," he said, choosing his words with the care he always brought to things that mattered, is a pattern of someone or two people acting together who are attempting to develop a comprehensive picture of your assets, your legal arrangements, and your vulnerabilities. The appraiser is the most concerning element because it suggests they're not merely planning, they may be in active preparation. He said a few more things, and we spent 2 hours talking through all of it, and when I left his office, I had set in motion the process of updating my will, designating my sister Patricia as my new healthcare proxy, and restructuring the durable power of attorney. My original document had been somewhat general, and Gerald wanted something much more explicit that named specific conditions under which power could be transferred, required multiple parties to agree, and that made clear, in language that any court would have to respect, that no single individual had unilateral authority over any aspect of my affairs.
I also opened a new savings account at a completely different bank that afternoon and moved 50% of my liquid savings into it. Not because I thought they could access my existing account, I didn't, but because I wanted a separation that they wouldn't know about. And finally, I scheduled a comprehensive physical with my doctor. Dr. Sonia Mehta has been my primary care physician for 11 years. She is thorough and warmly businesslike, and I respect her enormously. I told her in our appointment exactly what was happening and exactly why I wanted a full assessment, including cognitive evaluation. She looked at me for a moment with the particular look of a physician who has seen this kind of situation before, perhaps more often than people realize, and then she said, "Absolutely, let's do it properly." The results were, of course, exactly what they should be: cognitively sharp, excellent response times, no markers of any cognitive decline, physically healthy, blood pressure ideal, everything within normal range. Dr. Mehta wrote a formal letter stating her professional assessment of my full capacity, physically and cognitively, as of the date of examination. Gerald added it to the file. In May, something happened that moved things into a different territory. My neighbor Ruth called me on a Tuesday morning, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has been sitting on something and finally decided it has to be said. She had seen Daniel's car in my driveway again, not a social visit. He'd been there for about an hour while I was at the dental office. She'd noticed this time that he'd come out alone, without Jessica, and that he'd been carrying something, a folder, she thought, or an envelope. She couldn't be sure. I went home that afternoon and went through my filing cabinet with a fine-tooth comb. I went through every folder, every document. I could not say with certainty what, if anything, had been photographed or recorded, but I could say that my filing system, which I know with the intimacy of something I built and have maintained for years, had the faint quality of having been disturbed. Small things, slightly off position, a folder one spot to the left of where I always keep it, the kind of thing that only a very attentive person would notice. I called Gerald. He said, "We're going to add some documentation to the file about the repeated access." He also began making some inquiries of his own, quiet, professional inquiries through contacts in the local legal community about a certain law firm and certain related real estate and financial activities. I will tell you what he found because it is important, but first I have to tell you about the letter. I came home on a Friday evening in the middle of July to find an envelope tucked under my front door. No postage, my name written on the outside in handwriting I didn't recognize, small, neat, professional. Inside was a single-page letter from a law firm called Borden and Associates. The letter was written in the bloodless, calibrated language of legal correspondence, the kind that is specifically designed to sound formal and inevitable and unchallengeable, because lawyers who write this kind of letter are betting that the recipient doesn't know enough to push back.
It stated that the firm had been retained by Daniel R. Mitchell and Jessica A. Mitchell to, quote, explore options regarding the property located at my address in connection with, quote, a guardianship petition currently in preparation. A guardianship petition. I read the letter 3 times on the front porch, standing in the warm July evening with the street quiet around me and a cardinal singing somewhere in the silver maple I'd planted 20 years ago. Guardianship is a legal mechanism by which a person can petition a court to declare an adult incompetent to manage their own affairs and appoint themselves guardian with legal authority over finances, housing, health care, and virtually every significant decision in that person's life. It is typically used for people who have experienced serious cognitive decline or severe disability. It is occasionally used for other purposes entirely. My son and his wife, the woman I had cried with in the dress shop, the woman who had brought me chamomile tea, had hired a law firm to prepare a guardianship petition, to argue before a court that I was not capable of managing my own life so that they could manage it for me, so that they could manage my house, my money, my accounts, the $30,000 I had given them, and everything that came after it. I sat down on the porch step. I sat there for quite a while. The cardinal was still singing. Someone's sprinkler system came on down the street and made a soft, rhythmic sound. The evening light was gold and sideways and landing on the garden I had been tending for 20 years. I thought about it all, the whole long, warm history of us, Daniel and me, laid alongside this letter. I thought about him crying at the altar. I thought about the chicken soup the night before the wedding. I thought about dancing in that field, him holding my hand, and me thinking, remember this. I was not shaking. I have thought about that since. The fact that my hands were steady, my breathing was even, my mind was clear. I think that was the effect of having had months of quiet alertness. The shock when the confirmation finally arrived was not the lightning bolt kind. It was the kind that arrives as confirmation of something you'd already prepared for yourself. And that has a strange and very particular quality of grief. Not surprise, just sorrow, clean and unadorned. I picked myself up off the porch step. I went inside, I put on the kettle, and then I called Gerald Watts and left him a voicemail that was calm and clear and brief. Gerald called me back at 8:15 the next morning, Saturday. He'd listened to the voicemail twice. He told me, don't respond to the letter, don't contact Daniel or Jessica, don't acknowledge receipt in any form, let him handle it. I said, there's something else I want to do on my own initiative. He said, tell me. I told him I wanted to get a cognitive assessment on the record, a formal, medical, documented evaluation from my physician, establishing unequivocally that I was mentally and physically competent as of this date, and with no indicators of decline. Gerald was quiet for half a second, and then he said, absolutely, let's do it properly. I called Dr. Mehta's office the moment I hung up with Gerald. I had already had the general physical a few months prior, but I wanted something more recent, something specifically connected to the current situation. She got me in within the week. The results were, again, entirely clear. She updated her formal letter. Gerald also made inquiries, the professional, careful kind that lawyers make through channels available to them, and what he found over the following 2 weeks was disturbing and illuminating. Borden and Associates had been retained not only to prepare a guardianship petition, but also to prepare documents related to a property transaction involving my address, a preliminary listing agreement not yet signed, but drafted, discussed, and apparently ready for signatures once, as one of the documents apparently put it, the guardianship framework was in place. My house. They had a preliminary listing agreement drawn up for my house. Daniel had also, sometime in the spring, met with a financial advisor and discussed the management of what he had apparently called a family estate, his description, not mine, for my assets, as though management of that estate were either already his responsibility or about to be it. The advisor, to his credit, had not proceeded beyond the initial conversation, saying he required documentation of authority before doing anything. Daniel had apparently said he would be getting that documentation within a few months. The documentation he expected to get was the outcome of the guardianship petition. He was describing to a financial advisor the plan as though it were already in motion, as though it were only a matter of timing. Before I tell you what Gerald did next, I want to tell you about a conversation I had with myself in that period, because I think it's important and because I don't hear people talk about it enough. The internal conversation you have when you're in the middle of something like this, something that exists entirely between you and your own conscience, with no audience and no performance required.
I was sitting in my kitchen one morning in late July, about a week after I'd received the letter. My coffee had gone cold. The garden outside the kitchen window was doing what gardens do in July, overgrown in the way that looks either neglected or abundantly alive, depending on your frame of mind, and that morning it looked abundantly alive. The tomatoes were going. The zinnias I'd put in along the fence were enormous and completely out of control in the best possible way. Orange and magenta and yellow, the kinds of colors that are almost too much and are somehow exactly right. And I thought, what does it mean to be angry at someone you still love? Because I did still love him. I want you to understand that, and I want you to understand that I'm not saying it to be noble or to demonstrate my capacity for forgiveness or any of the other things that people sometimes perform when they're in a situation like this. I'm saying it because it was simply true, and because I think pretending it wasn't would be a kind of dishonesty. He was my child. He had been my child for 31 years, and the fact of that does not evaporate because of what he chose to do. Love that deep doesn't switch off. It transforms, maybe. It complicates. It lives alongside knowledge that makes it painful to carry, but it doesn't simply stop. And that coexistence, loving someone and understanding what they were capable of, holding those two things at once, was harder than any of the practical steps I was taking. Gerald and the lawyers and the documentation, all of that I could do with my hands. I knew how to do practical things. I had been doing practical things my whole adult life. But the interior work, the very private work of understanding what had happened and what it meant and what, if anything, I was going to do with the love that remained, that was something else entirely. I sat with my cold coffee and the July garden, and I thought about all the people I'd known who had been through something like this. Not exactly this, but adjacent to it, the specific grief of being betrayed by someone close. And I thought about the ones who had turned the grief into bitterness and the ones who hadn't, and what the difference seemed to be. And what I landed on that morning was this. The ones who didn't turn bitter weren't the ones who forgave faster or loved more. They were the ones who got clear, who looked at what happened with real, unflinching honesty, not looking away, not softening it, but also not catastrophizing it into something it wasn't, and then made very deliberate decisions about what to do next. Clarity, not niceness. That was the thing. I was going to be clear about what he'd done, about what I'd lost, about what I still had, and about what I was going to protect. And I was going to let the love exist in whatever form it took now, without trying to resolve it into something neater than it actually was. That, I found, was something I could do.
I finished my cold coffee, went out into the July morning, and deadheaded the zinnias until the garden looked like itself again. In August, Gerald sent a formal response to Borden and Associates. It was a long, precise, carefully constructed document, and the substance of it was this: Carol Mitchell is legally competent and is represented by counsel. She has a fully updated estate plan, a designated healthcare proxy, a durable power of attorney with specific multi-party requirements for activation, and a formal medical letter attesting to her full cognitive and physical capacity, dated within the past 60 days. Any petition for guardianship that does not rest on verifiable medical evidence of incapacity, and the bar for that evidence is very high, will be vigorously, expensively, and publicly contested. Additionally, the following activities have been documented, including unauthorized entry into the property and access to private financial documents, discussions with real estate entities regarding a property transaction not authorized by the owner, and representations made to a financial advisor regarding authority to manage another person's assets without any legal basis for that authority. These activities constitute, at minimum, the groundwork for civil action. In other words, we know what you've been doing, we have the evidence. Back off, or we make it extremely costly for everyone involved, including the lawyers. Gerald told me to expect one of two responses. Either they would retreat, or they would try to accelerate. They accelerated. 12 days later, Daniel called. It was a Saturday morning in August, one of those mornings where the heat arrives early and sits heavy on everything from the moment you wake. I was in the kitchen with coffee, and I saw his name on the screen, and I took a breath, and I answered. "Hey, Mom." The easiness in his voice that had always been there when he called me, that particular quality of uncomplicated comfort, was gone. In its place was something managed and careful. "Daniel, good morning. I heard from our attorney that your lawyer responded to the letter." No pretending then. "All right." "I did." A pause. Then, "Mom, I want you to know we're trying to help you. I don't know what's been said or who you've been talking to, but we're not trying to do anything bad here. We're genuinely worried about you." I knew this was exactly how he would frame it. It's the only available frame that makes it sympathetic, that makes it sound like concern rather than what it was. "We're worried. We love you. We're only thinking of your best interests." "I appreciate concern," I said. My voice was very even. "But there's nothing to be worried about. I'm healthy. I'm competent. I'm managing my life exactly as I've been managing it for 30 years. You're alone in that house." "I live alone by choice, Daniel. I have always lived alone by choice." "Things change. People get older and things can—" "I am 63 years old, Daniel. Not 83, not 93. 63 in excellent health, working, fully capable in every measurable and medical sense. My doctor has put that in writing. My lawyer has it." A silence. Then he tried a different angle, and this was the one that showed me the clearest view of what he actually thought was happening, that I was an obstacle to be managed, not a person to be reckoned with. "You know, the house is worth a lot right now. The market's been good. You could take that equity and put yourself somewhere really comfortable, somewhere you'd be—" "My house is not for sale," I said quietly, firmly, like a door closing. "I'm just pointing out that my house is not for sale. My finances are my own. My future is mine to determine. And I want to say this as clearly as I can, Daniel, because I don't want there to be any confusion. I love you, and I hope we find some way through this, but nothing about my life is going to be decided by anyone other than me. Not now, not in a year, not through any legal process that doesn't rest on evidence that doesn't exist." Another silence, longer this time. Jessica thought. This is not a conversation about what Jessica thought, and I meant it. He ended the call a few minutes later. I sat with my cold coffee and my steady pulse, and I allowed myself for the first time in this whole process to feel the anger. Not the hot, reactive kind. I've never much trusted that kind. The deep, settled kind. The kind that recognizes a clear and deliberate wrong and does not equivocate about calling it what it is. They had planned this alongside of everything, every warm dinner, every shared recipe, every dance, every sweet moment of the past 2 years, running in parallel with this scheme, not replacing it, running alongside it. And that coexistence, the genuine warmth and the deliberate calculation, was somehow more disturbing than if it had been entirely calculated, because it meant that it was possible for someone to love you and decide to take from you at the same time. And I had not previously believed that, not fully. I believe it now. Gerald made his next move. He sent a formal demand to Borden and Associates, outlining in precise legal language each documented incident with dates, witnesses if available, and the specific conclusions that the documented pattern supported, and demanding the immediate cessation of all activities related to my property, my finances, and any guardianship proceedings. The letter stated clearly that any continuation of those activities would result in civil suit being filed.